Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Tonight is the first inaugural presentation of the new Talking Public Affairs Committee, and we're very happy to see you all here. And we've got some folks sitting out in the fireside lounge. Ambassador LeVine is here tonight thanks to Joel Connolly, who is one of our recently new neighbors. So I am going to hand the microphone to Joel, and he will introduce the ambassador.
Good evening. We are watching in slow motion the Trump administration wrecking the federal government, alienating America's allies, and trying to shake down major law firms and universities. It is time, I think, for many people to think about what their citizenship obligations are, how they will resist trends that represent the darker side of the American dream, and generally how to become civically active again. No, there is nobody I can think of in Seattle better equipped to talk to those points than Suzan LeVine. She is somebody who headed a State Department under the Governor Inslee and was U.S. Ambassador to Switzerland under the Obama administration. Somebody who represented this country and knows how other countries and how other peoples think of us. And anyway, I think there's much to learn from her. And so I will shut up and I will allow her to be the teacher.
That's incredibly humbling, Joel, from somebody who has been and continues to be somebody from whom I learn so much. So thank you so much for the invitation to be here today, Joel. And now I have all these new friends as well, Sam and Bill and May and just the whole crew here. And of course, George and Sue, who I've known for a while now, for several years. And it's been a pleasure getting to know them as well. Thank you so much for having me. As Joel shared, I had the honor of serving our country under President Obama. I worked for him. He was my boss, which is always a fun thing to say. As our U.S. ambassadors, Switzerland and Liechtenstein, can never forget little Liechtenstein, punch far above their weight, despite the 43% tariffs. But that was my public sector turn. You should know that I also worked in the private sector for many years, and I started a couple of nonprofit organizations. In the private sector, I worked for Microsoft, which is what brought me out here 32 years ago. And then I worked for Expedia. Then I started a couple of nonprofit groups, one a Jewish community group, one for anybody associated with the University of Washington. I helped start an advisory council for the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences. So anybody who's got grandbabies or great-grandbabies, how do those brains work? That's what they're studying there. So it's very, very cool. But then President Obama asked me to work for him and to serve in that capacity, and it was very humbling and really did give me a deep sense of foreign affairs and what's going on around the world. I'm only going to be speaking for a few minutes, but what I want to do is to plant some seeds for topic areas for the questions. And I understand from previous presenters that you guys ask some pretty sharp and concise questions, which I really love, and I'm excited to field those. I would be more than happy to answer questions about my time in Switzerland, about what does a neutral country mean? What does neutrality mean? What does it mean today? What did it mean when I was serving? What do we think about from a foreign policy standpoint? What does the impact of the changes that Marco Rubio is proposing, what does that mean to us here? Other questions, I'm more than happy. We are 5 years out from the pandemic. The agency that I ran working for Governor Inslee was the Employment Security Department. So in the Employment Security Department, I ran the workforce system for Washington State, which runs unemployment insurance. I built and launched paid family and medical leave. and I ran the system to help people get jobs in our state. I then did that for President Biden, working in the Department of Labor as the acting assistant secretary, running the workforce agency for the country for the first 6 months of his time in office, healing that agency. And I'm also happy to talk about what is it like to come in post-Trump, post-apocalyptic into an agency. Fun, not fun conversation. But what I want to talk about right now is really what's going on domestically in our country. And Joel teed it up beautifully. We are in a situation, we're now at about 100 days into the Trump term. And while I certainly have a lot of associations and do a lot of work for Democrats, I am fundamentally a citizen. I am the daughter, granddaughter, and stepdaughter of veterans, and the daughter of a military spouse. And I care deeply about our country and the direction that it goes. I have kids who are 19 and 22, and they know that I, like my mother, start tearing up anytime John Philip Sousa is played. It's ridiculous. I used to laugh at her, and now I cry with her. She's 87. And when I look at what's happening right now, it's easy. Part of the strategy for the person who is living in the White House right now is emotional dysregulation, chaos, getting us off our game, getting us off balance. How might we be off-centered? And it's hard to tell the difference between distraction and destruction. Or as I heard somebody say, his weapons of mass distraction. Right? And you think about, is this action that he took the distraction, or is it the thing that he really wants done? Are the tariffs the distraction, or are they the thing? Is Signalgate and covering up for Hegseth the distraction or the thing? Is his demolition of DEI the distraction or the thing? And it's hard to tell. What I want to focus on is giving you all a sense of hope. How are we going to make it through this? And what can we do about it? But in a way that's focused and centered on being a good citizen. So, please, now Joel has been receiving my political emails for a number of years now, so he knows that I like rhymes, I like alliteration. My mother, when I practiced this on her earlier, she's like, it's a little trite, Susie, but give it a go. So you guys can tell me and judge me whether it's too trite, and then I'll scale it back. Hopes, nopes, dopes, and popes. You like, okay, so far so good. Okay, well first let me just start with Pope Francis. May he rest in peace. I am Jewish, and I appreciate what he has done for building bridges between the Catholic community and the Jewish community, and what he did for recognizing the role that Rome and the Vatican played over history. And I appreciate that in death, he is representing what he was like in life and being of the people. And that he is taking his direction of being in a simple casket and having as much connection with the people as he can. And I feel like that is a model that we all need to embrace right now and look at our own world and our own leaders for how we ask that of them. So that's the popes. And it'll be interesting to see who they choose. Now let's talk about the hopes. Anybody here remember Bacon's Rebellion from history class? Okay, so in the red shirt, what is your name? Doris. Doris, tell me what Bacon's Rebellion was.
It was a post-revolutionary revolt of farmers and people, as I recall, in western Pennsylvania against taxes that were, they felt were unfair. They, of course, were trying to send their produce down the Mississippi, and it got a lot more involved than that.
Are you a history teacher? Yes. Doris was a history teacher. Thank you, Doris. I picked the right person, and I didn't even mean to. This is my first time ever meeting Doris. Thank you. Bacon's Rebellion today, as I call it, is about Don Bacon in Nebraska. And he is one of 3 people who are in a district that Kamala Harris won. And I call him my canary in the coal mine. And he is conducting a rebellion. He has published an op-ed in which he supports Ukraine. He's been doing a lot of media with regards to encouraging them to have Hegseth find another opportunity. And then there are a couple of others who we're starting to see also follow suit. Mike Lawler in New York, and we'll see what happens with Brian Fitzpatrick in Pennsylvania. Again, those are the 3 who sit in these seats who are Republicans in seats that Kamala won. So Bacon's rebellion gives me hope. The next thing that gives me hope, kind of a strange hope, is what's happening with consumer sentiment right now, which is that people are expressing that they are not happy with what's going on. And that marries with what's also happening around faith in the economy. Trump killed us being people in general, he led on confidence with how he would treat the economy. He is now underwater, meaning he has dropped about 11 points on that measure and starting to falter. And again, that will give others the courage to stand up, because fundamentally, a lot of those electeds want to hold on to their own seats. And if being tied to the person whose confidence in whom confidence is declining, they may want to untether a little bit. So that gives me hope. The other thing that gives me hope is 5.3 million people showing up for a hands-off rally a couple of weeks ago. And did anybody here go to that? Awesome, fantastic, thank you so much. And we need to keep it going. When you look, for example, in Israel, where week after week, those people who wanted to protect the rule of law showed up, and then more people showed up, and more people showed up, and more people showed up. Or you look at places where they've been able to pull back from having an authoritarian government. You have to keep showing up, and keep showing up, and keep showing up in big and little ways. So last week, for example, many people were across doing smaller things. I was waving signs on an overpass. And then May Day will be another one, May 1st. So we're keeping up that momentum. The other thing that gives me hope is some of the backing off of the tariffs. Now granted, that's in response to the bond markets and to the other volatility, but at least we see that there's a threshold. That gives me hope. The other things that give me hope are what's been happening in the special elections and in some of the off-cycle elections, where people are turning out and making a different decision. So in Wisconsin, where Suzan Crawford won the state Supreme Court election by 10 points in a state that Trump won, that is about people taking action. And where the youth vote was higher than it's ever been, even in a presidential. That is huge. So it can happen. One other point that gives me hope is Mike Zimmer's win in Iowa. In his district, Trump won by 60%. Mike Zimmer won in a special election for his state legislative race at the beginning of this year, after Trump became president, so after the inauguration, 52 to 48. Huge swing in that win. That gives me hope. Now let's talk about the nopes. The nopes are the ways in which we are winning. Things, for example, in Florida in the special election for the congressional districts there, a swing of 15 points. Now, if you draw a 15-point ring around the election from the fall at the congressional races, 43 Republicans fall within that circle. 43 within a 15-point ring. If you just look at a 9-point swing, which is the average of what the special elections have been, that's 22 elected officials who are Republican. Even 5 points, let me make sure I make my notes correctly. 5 points is 15 individuals. Now what does that mean? That doesn't necessarily mean we're going to win all of those races, but it means those individuals will listen harder and better. And the town halls that are happening in their districts, Whether or not they are holding those town halls, they are hearing from their constituents, and people are speaking out and speaking up. That is so important right now. And along with the other nopes is all of the court wins. And you had Kevin Hamilton here recently who went much more deeply into this. But when you have Trump-appointed judges making decisions and highlighting that the executive orders are illegal, that is huge. Again, nope, not on our watch. Now, let's go to the dopes. I tend to not be that dismissive of individuals as dopes. I try not to take anybody for granted, and sometimes people use their dopiness as actually a way to woo you in and negotiate. I once sat next to a gentleman who was super thick South Carolina accent, and he's a state legislator, and he shared with me that when people hear him, they assume he's stupid. So he always wins the negotiations because he's not. And it's something that people really apply stereotypes in really bad ways. So I tend to not actually think anybody is a dope. Until Pete Hegseth. But he's a dangerous dope. What he has done with Signalgate, just to give you a little bit of insight just from my personal experience, I was honored and humbled to have the highest level of security clearance that is available for anybody in the United States other than the president. I didn't need to know, so I wasn't learning about things that weren't relevant to where I was. But in order to be able to go to a top secret computer or receive that information, I didn't have my cell phone with me. I was in a special, secure, compartmentalized information facility. And I knew that if I left material out, my Marines were going every day and looking at what it might have been left out, and I would have gotten in deep trouble had I done anything, even a resemblance of what he has done. The way in which he has endangered our armed services is so profound. And I think it's not because he's so smart that he's able to get around the system. So whatever you all can do in terms of encouraging him to not have his job and to find something else to do, please, like if you want to offer him a job somewhere else that's really attractive, fantastic. But he is a danger to us. The other is Elon Musk. He's a dope in a different way. He's ridiculously smart. But what he has done with Doge is a smart idea with a bad intention. When I worked in state government, during my time, 5 years ago was the pandemic, and I was able to have a very unique experience, and that was that the governor had emergency powers, and we suspended a lot of the regulations and worked around a lot of the limitations that I might otherwise have had to do my job. I was able to sign a multi-million-dollar contract with a consultant to resolve the fraud situation in 2 days. That doesn't happen. Anybody here who has worked in or observed or written about government knows that it's at least 6, if not 12 months to get such a thing done. So I know what fast and good government looks like. And I experienced it, and I was honored to have been a part of it. But it is about also making sure that you're protecting people's information. It is about how are you honoring what those agencies can and should be doing. And it is about partnering and building relationships. So the idea of make government better, hooray. But the idea of completely butchering it and eliminating the people who can do the work is horrifying. I was speaking with one of our members of our congressional delegation from here in Washington State, Emily Randall, who is part of her domain is Bremerton. And she was sharing with me that they fired the 3 people who, 2 of the 3 people who know how to change a particular type of light bulb on our nuclear submarines. right? They hired them back, but it's absurd. So that's the other dope. And they are dangerous. And again, I would encourage you in whatever ways you can to communicate that they should not be doing the work that they're doing. Hopes, nopes, dopes, and popes. I'm going to finish off with just a roadmap and then open it up for questions. As we think about where we are in the cycle, again, 100 days into Trump's term, over the next 2 to 4 years, there's going to be a few key milestones. One of them is going to be this fall. The Virginia and the New Jersey governor's races are going to be a really critical bellwether of what's happening in this country. They have historically been, and we expect that to continue. So for example, when we had a Democratic governor in Virginia win, then we won the Democratic presidency. When we had a Republican governor win, then we had a Republican win the presidency. So we've seen this time and time again, and we expect that that could also be a precursor and a bellwether this time. So keep an eye on the Virginia governor's election. And then in New Jersey, I grew up in New Jersey. Anybody here from New Jersey? Yeah. Got a few New Jersey folks here? Yeah. Woohoo! Jersey girl. Tell you a separate story about Bruce Springsteen not caring a whit that I'm a Jersey girl. New Jersey governor's race, one would think, well, of course that's going to be a slam dunk. No, actually, Phil Murphy, who is the current governor and is finishing his second term, he was the first governor, Democratic governor, to win 2 terms in a row since 1977. Right? So New Jersey actually does a lot of flipping. And so that is going to be a super tight race. And one that will be very interesting. June 10th is the primary for that. And we shall see what emerges from that election. Of course, the big kahuna is 2026 and the House. We are very blessed here to have a great congressional delegation. And our congressional delegation has a tremendous amount of power. With Suzan Delbene, who heads up the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, her raison d'etre, her reason for being right now in terms of her congressional work, in addition to representing her constituents, is to win back the House, win back the gavel. And so she is laser focused on that. And this past fall, despite Kamala losing the presidency, the Democrats made gains in 10 seats. We flipped 10 seats. And so that was some momentum. And Suzan is hoping to, of course, move that momentum even further. We also have a lot of state races that'll be really essential. Governor's races in most of the battlegrounds: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, not North Carolina. All of those states will have gubernatorial elections and statewide elections, especially for those secretaries of state who will then be holding the power for the 2028 presidential election. So when you think about the controversies of the past and the debates about the validity of the election, it's those governors and those secretaries of state who will really be in the pole position and the key position to really make some of those decisions and really have a lot of power in that election in 2028. So the 2026 state level elections will be essential for the 2028 presidential election. Now, I know a lot of people have been concerned about the security of the elections. I, for one, am very concerned about that. There was an institution that was stood up under Trump's first term called the Center for Internet Security for America, CISA is the acronym. It was actually headed up by a gentleman who used to work for Microsoft, Chris Krebs. And CISA has been eliminated. CISA's job was to work with states and fund them and support them for fighting cybersecurity attacks, for cyber attacks that were happening related to elections. So now that challenge of protecting the states falls on the states. But there are efforts to try to support them and help them. And we'll see what happens on that front. I think, again, this fall, the election in Virginia will be a critical one to look at. And there is a deep focus to make sure that we still have safe and fair elections, of course, in 2026 and then in 2028. So I'm going to stop now. But again, I am happy to take whatever questions you all have. But the first question, I appreciate the big wave back there. The first question is actually I'm gonna let George or Sue ask that because they've been so wonderful over so many years. If they have a question, George, Sue?
Yes. Susie, I would like to hear about your experiences as the ambassador in terms of being of a neutral country. What lessons are there?
Thank you so much. And Sue, do you have another question to add? Go ahead. Okay. Raise your hand if you have played sports in your life. Raise your hand if you have kids or grandkids who play sports. All right, we got everybody here. Now, how many of you have picked one team or the other? How many of you picked being the referee? Now, raise your hand if you, this is like a calisthenics class. Raise your hand if you have watched a sporting event and said how dumb the referee is. Switzerland is the world's referee. And they choose that, and they have been doing that for over 500 years. Since the Battle of Marignano, which was the last battle in which Switzerland participated. But here's what's super interesting about that. 500 years ago, they then became mercenaries. So the Swiss sold their services, and you would actually often have one brother on one side and one brother on the other side. The vestige of this today, and we saw it in the newspaper yesterday, is the Swiss Guard for the Pope. They are Roman Catholic Swiss military members. It is a credible honor for them to serve in that capacity. And those Swiss Guard are actually from Switzerland. And it is a rotation that they do in their military service. Some of the key things that I learned about neutrality. Neutrality is not pacifism. They are armed to the teeth. Seriously. And they can all go into the mountains if there is an attack. The mountains are hollowed out, and there is enough room for all the Swiss citizens to go into the mountains should they be attacked. During World War II, all of the bridges were set up with TNT, so that should the Italians come in, should the Germans come in, they could blow them up. As a neutral entity, what I learned is the power and value in debate. So, Bill, you're a law professor, right? If I disagree with you, you're going to ultimately try to persuade me, right? Here's what's interesting. If you are a neutral entity, you are uniquely able to speak to perhaps my foe. So let's say Joel is not somebody with whom I have any relationship. You would be able, as a neutral entity, to be an interlocutor for me. And it's actually really important that it not seem like you're on my side. And rather, you can then have a much more efficacy-filled connection to Joel and to me. So when I would have debates with the Swiss, or I would do what's called démarche, which is to make a demand of the Swiss, and they would say no, I might have a little tantrum, but that tantrum was actually really important because it demonstrated their neutrality. And it's really hard for me to first get used to that because I wanted to win them over. But sometimes there was no winning them over. They are a protecting power with Iran. So there are thousands of American citizens living in Iran. And they represent us to them and they help serve those individuals. They also are the ones who would host, for example, there was the JCPOA, the negotiation that Obama signed, the agreement with Iran. Most of it was hosted in Switzerland. So one other aspect about neutrality that I learned, and I was mentioning this earlier in the conversation, neutrality is a business model. We pay them to be that interlocutor for us. They provide a service for us as our protecting power. When we developed relations with Cuba, they had been that service, and then that service went away. They also, when they host negotiations, as somebody who worked at Expedia, I appreciate this. They're selling hotel rooms. They're getting reservations in restaurants, right? It's their, instead of tourism, they're doing negotiations. So neutrality plays a really fascinating and important role for us as Americans, for our country, and for our globe. And neutrality has many fascinating aspects to it. Right? Seriously, right? Like, neutrality is kind of interesting. Doesn't make me want to be the referee, but that's okay. Now, you are waving your hand wildly. Your name? Hi, Michael. Hang on one second. There's a microphone coming your way. Oh, Sue, did you have a question first? I'm so sorry. 1 second, Michael. We'll come back to you. Sue.
We have a very low rate of young people voting. What can we do to get them more involved and understand the importance of their vote?
We did, but there are efforts that are working. So I mentioned Wisconsin. So I'm going to talk about a guy named Teddy Landis. So Teddy he looks like he's 12 years old. I think he's maybe 25. He recently graduated, super smart, crazy humble, and he's doing really nutty things. So for example, for the first state Supreme Court race in Wisconsin, where he generated a 250% increase in youth voter turnout over Biden's win in 2020. So for Janet Protasewicz in 2023, 250% increase. He had people going out in judicial robes to the bars with doilies around their necks and taking selfies and videos with folks and posting them up on TikTok. Totally hammered. He had stickers for people's computers that were completely inappropriate, and I won't use the phrases that they had. He created condoms for the students to pass out to each other. And this isn't something that the party can do or that the candidate can do, but you can have some of these entities who are working in the communities. And the key is having the individuals who are young people themselves and also understanding their timing. So if you're going to universities, if your first organizing of individuals is in September, you are too late and you're done. You need to have all of your stuff all together by the springtime so that when you have welcome week, you're welcoming them and registering them to vote. But you also need to be at the community colleges where people are in transit. And it is about how do you have authentic conversations and demonstrate here's what we are doing in terms of the policies that we are actually putting in place. Part of the challenge for young people, and we saw, okay, you ready for your heads to pop? This made my head pop when I heard this statistic. Young women swung 14 points to the right this past November. Young women between the ages of 18 and 25. I was like, there's no way. But there is a way, and it's what happened. And it's because they're feeling disenfranchised. It's because they don't see an economic future. And it's because they are feeling seen and they are feeling included where Democrats have failed to reach out. Now, granted, a majority of young women did still vote Democrat, but a 14-point swing for young women is a huge wake-up call. And it's understanding that there is traction. Charlie Kirk has made a huge amount of inroads into the young right and gotten a lot of people to listen. So it's a matter of really rethinking our approach. And Pete Buttigieg, who I just adore, has a really great frame around this. And he talks about we need to really update what we are saying, how we are saying it, to whom we are saying it, and really, really adjust and adapt. Does that answer your question, Sue? Of course, but it's a question you should ask every single person coming before you, whether it's a person asking you for their vote or a person who is saying that they understand the political zeitgeist right now. Michael.
I am going to ask your indulgence and talk about what's personal to me and why I'm personally here. Everything you say is marvelous. Yes, there are all kinds of things we can do, and there are the courts and there are elections. I have the feeling that our rules are not Donald Trump's rules. But we play by our rules because we're decent. He is not a decent person. And the purpose of everything he does. Like, Doge is Doge. He doesn't want the federal government to work. He wants to cause distress everywhere. So people act as if what he does is a real policy issue. And to me, it's not. This is at least my view. And I don't know how we're going. He's a schoolyard bully, and I don't know how we're going to vanquish him. Can you help?
Michael, I wake up every day thinking about what I can do about that. And there are ways to help. There are ways to make sure that we are winning elections. We vanquish him by winning. And Musk put in tens of millions of dollars into that Wisconsin State Supreme Court race. Now let me plenty of people here understand why that race mattered. But when you go back to 2016, so let me share with you a little bit of history. I got to meet Obama in 2005. I was 6.5 months pregnant. I was on the Hill advocating for some issues that mattered. He walks in the room as the junior senator from Illinois, and most of the people in the room with me were from Chicago, so he knew most of them, but I was the one he didn't recognize, and I stuck out like a sore thumb. He comes over, he puts his hand on my shoulder, and he acknowledges my enormous belly and says, "How are you feeling?" And I was like, pretty awesome right now. And I became all Obama all the time. That was my first political awakening. And I love the man. And I was very dedicated to him, and I remain very dedicated to him. But what he failed to do was to focus on the infrastructure and the foundation, and on races at the state and local level. And as a result, 2016 happened. Hillary was just an outcome of work that had been done in 2010 with $30 million at the end of that election to win the state legislatures across the country, and then utilize that power to gerrymander and break our democracy. That led to going from 25% of congressional seats being contested to less than 5%. And when you have that kind of imbalance, what it leads to is that they don't have to listen to their constituents. And so what we need to do is to make sure that we focus on winning the special elections, which we're doing now handily across the United States at state levels. So next week is a big state legislative special election in Minnesota, for example, for a state senate. And it's also making sure that we have the infrastructure that we need to reach people. So Sue talking about how we're reaching young people. We need to build up a relationship with online influencers, macro and micro. What does that mean? What does that look like? And so how can we contribute to that? Well, for one, you all have your own networks. So making sure that you're communicating out to people. If you have friends who live in Nebraska, who live up in Westchester, New York, who live in southeastern Pennsylvania, make sure that they are out pressing Don Bacon, Mike Lawler, Brian Fitzpatrick, and make sure that they are pressing the Republican congressional members and holding them accountable, because that's going to be part of what takes Trump back a step from what he's able to accomplish. What we also need to do is to make sure that we're supporting those entities who are not cowing and caving to him. So if you are an alumni of a university, I recommend reaching out to them to encourage them to stand up against the funds that have been withdrawn erroneously from those institutions. So I went to Brown University, and I've been in direct contact with the president there to really encourage her and let her know that I and many other alumni support efforts to stand up against Trump. And the more alumni, the more people with influence into those universities, the fewer Columbias we'll have, and the more Harvards we'll have, and Princetons and Wesleyans. And so there's a number of ways that we can do that. Similarly, law firms. If you have your business with Perkins Coie, make sure you support them and stay with them. And I wouldn't ordinarily say that about a law firm, but the work that they are doing and that the others are doing to stand up to him, we can also stand behind them and support them. If you are a lawyer or you play one on TV or you have them sign on to amicus briefs for some of these cases. Because the judicial system is holding tight for now. So it's not a full answer, Michael, and I don't have the perfect answer on that. But these are the things that I know I'm doing that give me strength and that also are having a bit of an impact. So does that help? A little bit? A little bit. Thank you. Of course. Thank you, Michael. Other questions that folks have?
I am an avid supporter of Maria Glusenkamp-Perez down in the 3rd District, who has voted this year to both sanction green and also for the SAFE Act, which has caused it from social media, apparently has caused her a lot of alienation. How would you counsel us to deal, those of us feeling strongly progressive, to deal with our blue dog brethren that may make cause with the GOP?
Thank you so much for asking that question. I hear you. I hear you deeply. And so I do a little e-newsletter, and I wrote very specifically about this point, why I disagree with her and I support her. And we need to find a place to be comfortable with that. She does not serve in Seattle. She serves in the 3rd District, which includes, yes, super far lefty Vancouver, but also includes Klickitat, right? And so she has such a broad array. And for her to win, she needs to make some decisions with which we might be uncomfortable. I focus on the gavel. And in 2026, it'll end up being 2027, in January 2027, I want to make sure that Hakeem Jeffries is holding that gavel. And the only way to do that is by having people like her, Jared Golden, and others who make votes that make me super uncomfortable. I spoke with her and her team about the SAVE Act before she voted in support of that act. But here's how I think about the strategic nature of that. The Republicans will set a lot of traps. They control the agenda. They control the language that will come forward in bills. So they are going to do everything they can to make uncomfortable votes for people like Marie Glusenkamp-Perez. This past fall, she had to vote, and as did all of the members of the House. Do you reauthorize the National Defense Authorization Act and eliminate insurance coverage for transgender care or not? Now, I have a friend who has a transgender child, and that was crossing the transom for them. And they were like, I can no longer support her. But as she thinks about her constituency, she needed to vote for that bill and still authorize the military funding. I look at 2 votes that she did in the past few weeks in particular to gauge, will she be there when we need her? One is the continuing resolution, the budget, which, as you all know, did pass because the Senate ended up supporting that, and some of the senators like Chuck Schumer supported it. She did not. She voted against that continuing resolution. And the reason she did so, and I talked to her about this, was because every single vote mattered on that. If any Democrats, and Gerald Golden did, he voted for the continuing resolution. So he was the one Democrat who voted against the Democratic caucus, but she did not. But the Republicans had no votes to spare. And had she flipped on that one, it would have led to them putting more crazy stuff in the bill. So she knew she needed to keep it tight. On the SAVE Act, she knew the House was going to pass it no matter what. And she was hearing from her constituents the importance of her supporting the SAVE Act. Now, she is opposed to it, and she proposed some alterations and changes to it. And if you read her press release about it, it was a reluctant vote. But it was one that she knew that her vote didn't matter per se. It didn't affect the outcome of that election. So censuring Congressman Green, that was very personal to her. My understanding is she did that because she doesn't think that that behavior is right. I don't agree or I'm not talking about my position on that. But I think that we, in pursuit of the gavel, need to think about disagree and commit. You have a follow-on question for that?
I'm sorry.
Keep it brief.
It's okay, Aaron.
It's just, I agree with everything you've said, and I share your perspective largely, and I have been an avid supporter. My wife is, like your friend, saying, I can't support her anymore. And that's what I'm really trying to figure out is how do I respond to that? How do I encourage them to think of the gavel? I like that phrase, and I don't really want to take more time, but that's part of my problem.
Tricks and traps. Think about the tricks and traps, because there are a lot of tricks and traps that are being laid. And those tricks and traps are things like, do you support Israel or do you support anti-Semitism? And they're like insane votes that are being put forward that they have to decide how they're going to vote. And we're going to see more and more of those, especially as the election comes up, and they control that. So one is tricks and traps, and the other is to read. She's very open about why and how she's voted different ways. And some things we may not agree with, or we may. Personally, I'm a huge fan of apprenticeship, so I actually understand her vote when she did not agree with relieving the student debt, because she felt like there wasn't enough investment in apprenticeship and in other opportunities and pathways before going forward with the student debt. I get that argument. I totally understand it. But we need to understand that getting the gavel is the critical aspect here. And I loved Carolyn Long, but she didn't get elected. She got smoked in that district. So.
Yes, I'm wondering, given your experience and given the Trump and the Republicans in Congress really going more toward Putin, do you think Europe has the capacity and the willingness to step into the breach vis-a-vis Ukraine?
Thus far, it appears to be so. It seems like Macron, it seems like the Germans, that the Brits seem to be holding tight on that. We shall see. It'll be an interesting few weeks. In the next few weeks, as a few things are going to happen. At the Pope's funeral, they're all going to be there. So I think that there will be some dynamics that we'll get to observe. And Zelensky is not taking the United States negotiating point. And it feels like there will be an opportunity for the Europeans to basically really support Zelensky, which they've done thus far, and Ukraine. And I feel like that there will be an opportunity. It's interesting because Switzerland was never in any of this stuff. But this is one space where with Ukraine, when the Crimea invasion happened, the Swiss actually took some action. And the action was around finances and enabling the sanctioning of various individuals through the financial sector and the banking sector. And it's so blatant. Trump's affinity and affiliation with Putin is so blatant. And we can see some upending of the world order on that front, but I believe that the Europeans will be pushing back pretty hard on that, especially the polls. Keep an eye on the polls.
Yes.
Dr. Keeler has been waiting for quite some time here.
I've been looking at the gerrymandering issue, And if you look now, given the actions that have actually been taken by the current administration, they're really hard on people. People who have money, people who don't have money, people who want to buy eggs, people. Looks like we'll be moving toward inflation and all, and it's beginning to be noticed by everybody. By everybody, I mean even people who were quite interested in supporting Mr. Trump. And so it used to be that the way that the Republicans kept the same kind of control was anybody who had some ideas that was different from Trump, like a moderate Republican, they say, we're going to get you in the primaries because there's obviously you're in a Republican district and whatnot. The question is, will it be possible now, given that the public is beginning to notice the impact of this, and you can see it in some of the current by-elections, to have fidelity and worship of Trump be a negative, even in the primarily Republican districts that are there now, thus shifting the impact of the gerrymandering?
Thank you for that question. I mean, part of what Trump is trying to do, of course, is to change how elections are run. And so the SAVE Act in particular that he is trying to get around with an executive order, for example, would disenfranchise any woman whose name is different than on their birth certificate. That would include me. Or any overseas voter, and anybody who doesn't have various government documents. So he's trying to change who can even vote in order to disenfranchise those who might actually recognize the danger that he poses. What I was pulling here was I brought some data. When you look at that now only 37% of Americans approve of Trump's handling of the economy from a recent Reuters Ipsos poll that just came out, and this is lower than at any point during his first term. A Pew poll is now showing that less than half of all U.S. adults, 45%, have confidence in his ability to make good decisions about the economy, and that is a 14-point drop from the 59% that he held in November when he won. So it's dropping like a stone, and back to Michael's point, this is going to also give an off-ramp for those elected officials who are within that 5-point boundary and who want to keep their jobs, because they will lose. They will lose the House substantially if they stay attached to this dropping stone. And so there is going to be a threshold of consumer confidence, of faith in this current president that is going to then flip the positions for those in Congress. I believe, I could very well be wrong, because I also know that part of what the strategy with releasing the January 6th prisoners was in order to basically create an army of thugs to threaten people's well-being. So when Senator Lisa Murkowski said that they're afraid, she wasn't just afraid for her reputation or her election. She's afraid for her physical safety. And people are crazy. I mean, I'll point out that during the pandemic, there I was just working for the state, right, public servant, and on Twitter, people threatened my kids. I had to have security outside my house. People are crazy when they are threatened, when they don't have what they need, and yet I have deep compassion for their pain. I have a compliment for Trump. I'm going to do the complex version of it, and then I'll share the David Brooks simple version of it. My complex version, and this is what I experienced when I was in Switzerland and I saw, he is masterful at diagnosing the problem. He has perverse and corrupt prescriptions. And I saw this around workforce, where in Switzerland, I fell in love with the apprenticeship system there, where 70 to 80% of kids do apprenticeship, not even high school. And it's an amazing system, and I've worked very hard to bring it here. Guess who is the master of The Apprentice? Trump. And he has done so much in that space very effectively. And it's like the one bipartisan zone that's actually pretty powerful and special. But he identified that and the issues that people were facing and the lack of opportunity that people saw going forward so much better than Hillary did, unfortunately. And that's part of why people had faith in him as the change candidate. But he is failing that now. And people are seeing that and they're feeling it. And sure, he will have 35% of the diehards always. But there's a lot of people who are feeling a lot of pain. And that is not going to work for him in the longer term, but I believe also in the shorter term.
One of the pains that
And your name?
I'm Ina.
Hi, Ina.
A pain that many are now experiencing is something that people experienced during the Second World War, during the Soviet Union, when people were just picked up on the street, when there was a knock at the door in the middle of the night, and you were gone. I speak from experience. I'm afraid of what I see today on television, how people disappear, whether they are foreigners, whether they are Americans. And this is going to continue if this doesn't get stopped. It is a nightmare. Can you give me hope?
I can make a request of you and everybody else, and that is to support those institutions that are fighting back against that. And I'm looking at what's happening with Kilmar Abrego Garcia and the support for his family, having elected officials go there and shine a spotlight on that and not forget him and not let that issue drop. And that the Supreme Court 9-0 said, bring him back. With a caveat, I know that there was a caveat there. The other issue that deeply concerns me, speaking of that, is earlier this week, professors at Barnard, to their personal cell phones, received a survey that asked them if they are Jewish, if they are Israeli, and how they care about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to their personal cell phones. Now, the mistake of Barnard was that they provided those cell phones to the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So this was an official request. It was voluntary in terms of responding. But the last time that we had a catalog of Jews, it did not turn out so well.
No kidding.
Similarly, RFK is creating a catalog of those individuals with autism. So we have some very, very serious issues, which is why it's going to take all of us. And which is why I appreciate you guys coming out this evening for this conversation. And we need to energize ourselves. We need to energize our kids, our friends, our neighbors, but especially those people who we know who are in Republican districts and or reaching out across the aisle to help people know how it affects us personally. Because it's easy to say that's so far away, right? We're in Seattle. We have the University of Washington. Who cares about Columbia? Who cares about Barnard? Who cares about what's happening with individuals there, whatever? But you're absolutely right. People are being disappeared. So it's very, very serious, and we need to make sure that we are staying vigilant. And there's organizations to also support on this front as well, who are providing that kind of legal services and support, the ACLU, for example. For federal workers who have been laid off, erroneously, there's now a federal defense fund that the Partnership for Public Service has created in partnership with labor. So there is a lot of work that is being done and that we can support. Yes, please.
Yeah.
And it's Connie, I see.
Connie, yes.
Hi, Connie.
There are quite a number of us here who have been writing postcards
Great.
and letters to various organizations. Do you see that as productive, and do you have any other suggestions for little old people like us?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Actually, I did a pre-briefing with my mother on the way over here, and she said, Susie, you need to make sure that you have some calls to action for them. And she can no longer write legibly, so she's like, and make sure that you have different abilities that you tell people. So postcards definitely are a good solution. Another is the 5 Calls app. There's a phone, for those who have cell phones, there is an app called 5 Calls that will help guide you in making calls to your elected officials. The other is reaching out to your friends and those that you know. Like I was saying, I think that it doesn't exist yet, but think about making 5 calls to friends who live in battleground states, to people that you know who live in Texas, in other places across the United States who aren't necessarily, in Spokane, right? Who aren't necessarily here in our bright blue bubble. Or people here who are independent and they themselves may have other contacts and other connections. So that's some of the things that can be done. The other is if you have resources to contribute. Now, raise your hand if you have been annoyed by a text asking you for money. Right? Or like the 13 that I've probably received since I started this conversation. So a couple of things about that. So I have done a lot of what I call resource raising over my time in the political world since 2007 was when I first started doing that as a volunteer. And all of this is as a volunteer, to be clear. And part of why those texts happen is because they work and people respond. And so because they raise so much money, they keep doing it. But they're aware that it annoys people and they know that there's a diminishing return to it. So at some point, I'm hopeful that they stop sending so many. But in the meantime, I recommend being very strategic and just thinking about where you want to donate and not just responding. So in terms of recommendations, I would encourage you to think about the priorities this year of Virginia and New Jersey, to think about some of the infrastructure organizations that are doing things strategically. And I need to be careful because Sam told me not to be too political, and I know I've already kind of crossed a bit of that line. Maybe follow up afterwards and I can make some other recommendations. But think about the House of Representatives, and there's 435 seats. I know I personally can't make donations on all 435, so I look to certain organizations to guide me in that, or to do, where are there some economies of scale. Also the parties themselves provide some of those economies of scale, whichever party one aligns with. And I'm trying to be better, Sam.
Can we take one more question?
Yeah, absolutely. But so those are some of the things. Connie, does that help?
We get one here.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Betsy Bell.
Hi,
And
Bessie.
this is maybe an academic issue, but I'm very concerned about the Heritage Foundation, and I've been watching them since the 80s. And I feel like the guy who wrote 2025 is probably one of the most difficult and heinous people that we have at the helm. And I wondered if you'd like to comment at all about the Heritage Foundation and its role in where we are today.
Well, for one, I think they're brilliant. And I think that the person who did Project 2025 did the work. And I admire that greatly. Just like, I admire Dr. Evil, right? They did the work. And I'm going to do another survey. Has anyone here ever been frustrated by their interaction with government? Right? Government can be really frustrating. And what they've been able to do is to exploit that frustration. And oftentimes, and this is the challenge that Democrats face, is that they are defending growing government and defending sometimes when government doesn't work. And what the Republicans want is smaller government, or what was that one line that Dick Cheney, like the right side, Karl Rove, right? The right size of government is the kind that you can flush down the toilet, right? So something like that. I'm not good at remembering specific quotes, but it's something where we've been in this debate forever of big versus small. And what they did was they changed it to small and better, right? And so it was brilliant what they did. And I think that as we look ahead, it's how do we not dismiss that outright, but rather look at what does better actually mean? And what is the role of government in our lives? And where, for example, there was this interview with Pete Buttigieg where he was talking about government's not going to make the iPhone, but government made the internet. Government is not going to produce the pills, but government is going to provide the long-term research and support for mRNA. And so how do you understand and create a better system on that? As somebody who ran a part of the social safety net for the state and for the country, we were working with a system that was created by, God love her, and her birthday is, her birthday just was, Frances Perkins, the first secretary, female secretary, love her. 1935 was when the Social Security Act passed. And we're still using that same safety net, but in a completely different environment today. And we haven't had the courage and the investment to really ask that deep question of what should we have, what needs to be different or changed, and how do we actually do it? So the Heritage Foundation and others are really interesting. Cato, AEI, are interesting in terms of what they represent around think tanks that are nonprofits and how you use nonprofit and tax-deductible money for political purposes. And to me, those are some of the more interesting questions to ask about their role. As we look ahead, what we need is the equivalent of a Project 2029, because this is going to be post-apocalyptic. The way in which the systems are being broken and broken down. I saw a baby version of that when I entered the Department of Labor, and there hadn't been a town hall with my team since 2016 when I entered in 2021. They hadn't hired anyone into the organization in 4 years. The team that ran, okay, quick quiz. How many people do you think at the time of the pandemic in the federal government were running unemployment insurance for the federal government? Not the state, federal government. Any guesses? Running unemployment insurance, like the unemployment insurance system for the whole country. How many people were running it at the federal government level? How many? 1,000? 30. 30 people. Yeah, exactly. So that was a baby version of what is happening right now. And we will need a solution. Will that solution come from the center/center left organizations like Brookings or Center for American Progress or New America? I'm not sure. I think that they're probably thinking about that. But we're going to see we're going to see a phoenix rising out of these ashes. And it should be pretty interesting and hopefully exciting. But in the meantime, what we need to do is to fight against what's really decimating and denigrating our country right now. So, thank you all so much.